I'm Zuber-Skerritt, the producer of a series of books and video programs on Australian playwrights. My aim is to promote Australian drama, especially overseas, and to help teachers and students better understand the particular playwright's aims, intentions, personal background and visions. The program you are about to see is an interview with John Romeril from Melbourne, and the interviewer is Gareth Griffiths, Professor in the English department at the University of Western Australia. John Romeril's major work include Chicago, Chicago, The Floating World, I Don't Know Who to Feel Sorry For, and Lost Weekend.
John Romeril, thanks very much for letting us talk to you today. I wonder if we could start off by asking you when and how you began to work in the theatre.
Yeah, it was 1968. And as a result, really, of the emergence or the development of La Mama, a small theatre that operates still in Carlton. Betty Burstall had come back from America with a vision. She'd had a dream. She'd seen over there a small theatre run by Alan Stewart called Cafe La Mama, which was responsible for breaking the work of Sam Shepard, to name but one, but Megan, Terry, Van Italia and people of that sort. So she came back with this idea of a meeting place, essentially, where not just playwrights, but poets and musicians could air their work to a sympathetic audience, very small scale, serving coffee and not much else. Cafe-style theatre. And around that place, it was in some ways a stimulus for a lot of us. It became a focus, a place where we could work, and a group began to gather that later went on to become the Australian Performing Group and found the Pram Factory and struggled through until 1980 when it finally ran out of legs.
So are there particular movements or forces within development of theatre in this century, or particular artists, writers, directors that have had a direct influence on your work and the developing framework for your work in that way?
Certainly. I mean, I think I hope I can remember them. I think the major aestheticians, people who've written about theatre as an art, for me, have been Brecht, Meyerhold, and Piscator, with a little bit of Eisenstein thrown in. These are all people who address the question, what sort of theatre art is appropriate to mass 20th century life? Essentially, we have arrived at a century where cities are big, where thanks to industrialization we have large concentrations of people, where the basis of an economy has shifted from that of rural activity to urban and industrial activity. Where there are just mass conglomerations of people. Now, what sort of an art form, what sort of an art is appropriate to that, to how we live now? And the procedures that those three sort of people laid down, I think they answered that question in very deep and profound ways, and addressed it all their lives, really. And I came to study them and take on board some of their perspectives and begin to apply them to an Australian situation. And in Australia, of course, you have a country that is par excellence an urbanised society, has been for so long it doesn't matter.
Contrary to the popular mythology in many ways.
Sure. So, you know, what kind of art do you make in a big city? With a big city that is affected by mass industrialization, by the division of labour, by the way we make things, by the commodification and so on of production. And what kind of a culture do you spin out of those circumstances? So in many ways that's been the major issue It's not a question that I posited first, but it's one that in my small way, I suppose, I've continued to tackle, always in the shadow of those three great minds.
Do you have a specific artistic or social program which in some sense influences your work?
Yeah, I do. The drama is of necessity, I think, to do with conflict. If things aren't at risk, if things aren't in jeopardy, if values aren't being questioned, if there isn't a kind of, if the theatre isn't an arena in which criticism can be mounted, it ceases to be dramatic. You don't have a drama when things aren't in question. Will so-and-so get it in the neck or not? Is a very basic example of a thing being problematic. You don't know the outcome. And the theatre, or the drama, as opposed perhaps to comedy, but things are in contention. They haven't been decided. That's when the drama occurs. It doesn't occur when things are known. And I suppose the political angle, if one is as I am, persuaded that we do not live in the best of all possible societies, if there is work to be done to achieve a better society than the one we have, then of course one gets a bit interested as an artist in the drama, as an arena where you can mount questions of that sort and perhaps begin to supply answers.
Do you see your work within that interest as having fallen in any way into periods or distinctive periods?
I've stylistically, yeah, I'm a bit of a theatrical animal, a bit of, I'm not of by nature terribly tidy. I'm often working on perhaps 2 or 3 shows, slowly bringing them on, and they can be very various stylistically. I mentioned my apprenticeship. I should perhaps elaborate a little on that. It was perfect for me, and anyone who I couldn't wish it on I can but wish it on anyone else. That's getting in there and attaching yourself to a theatre company. It's the way to learn your craft, to learn it on the floor. Now, the company I happened to attach myself to, we should call it the La Mama Company, and it became the Australian Performing Group, had, of course, some sense of mission. We existed in what we took to be a theatrical vacuum in a way. We didn't have or weren't aware of theatrical forebears. We weren't continuing the great Australian tradition because that great Australian tradition had never existed. The theatre here has always had a very hard road to hoe. And if you took the job of the theatre as we did to be that of refracting, that of imaging the society around us, getting more or less the Australian accent on stage, not a thing that had been done a great deal, getting images of our society on stage, that task we took very seriously. It also took us down many roads, and there are many ways of doing it. I happened to grow up with a number of people who were tired of what is essentially the theatre of the well-spoken word. It's the case that the theatre that existed was given over to British product and to American. We, of course, wanted to create an Australian playhouse, to create Australian works that accurately reflected the society around us. But stylistically, and the move to La Mama, for instance, provided something of a key. As a place, as a piece of architecture, it wasn't a huge theatre. You didn't therefore have to have a huge voice. Your vocal equipment was not the major equipment that you had to have well-tuned and ticking over. The same people were also kind of a rock and roll generation, so we were used to using our bodies. And the use of the body in the theatre, be it in the form of dance or simply using space, taking space, began to be the major focus of the work. So I learnt to write for the body, for the actor, to trigger responses, to get actors working, provide a storyline, provide images, provide finally some dialogue, but basically provide a scenario that could be physicalized. Physicalization is the major weapon, I think, that the theatre has.
Have you had a consistent view of targeting an alternative audience to that of mainstream theatre through a lot of your work, or has this just been the product of wanting to work, as you say, being untidy, to put it in your own words?
Well, of course, that project in some ways was what confronted us was it's one thing to build the Australian Playhouse, you also have to develop the audience for it. Otherwise, you're going nowhere. So, of course, I've always taken a very keen interest in audience development, in building the box office, in getting people through the gate. There is absolutely no percentage in writing great plays that only the bottom drawer sees. An audience completes the work. Acting, live acting, as opposed perhaps to film and television, is an art form that actually is affected by the presence of the audience. What that audience is feeling and transmits itself back to the stage. Actors always have, even if only subliminally or subconsciously, a sense of how the show's going, how to play the night, how to work that audience. So, of course, relating to an audience is just part and parcel, in my view, of the theatrical contract. Now, the notion of choosing an audience or trying to build a specific audience, there's something a little fascistic in that. But of course, you do pitch your work towards areas you think may be receptive. Hey, you listen to me, this is something that will benefit you. Look at this, come, check this out. Get onto this, this is a good show, this is a hot show. Generating interest.
In fact, your work has you've worked in fact, the whole range of kinds of theatre institutions in Australia, from mainstream theatre through what we could call community theatre to specific works for trade union movement, projects and so on. And interestingly, you've never ever denied access of your text to different theatres. I mean, The Floating World, that was produced originally at Café La Mama, was then produced in a very glitzy production at the Sydney Theatre Company a few years ago. So this is a kind of open, deliberately open policy. I mean, the text is there to be used by whoever can make something of it, or?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I don't have a very proprietorial interest in those things, and also in some ways my own sense of democracy means that when a mob chooses to do a show, they should make it their own. They should own the work. And often, of course, that means they will leave their paw prints on it, one way or another.
In the 70s, you wrote a number of plays. Chicago, Mrs. Sally F. come to mind. What were you trying to say in those plays?
Well, in the case of Mr. Stalieff, again another instance, I suppose, of me using actual social history to springboard off. But it was teamed up with a show called Christian Love, which was about a male murderer. The APG at the time had, therefore, 3 women actresses spare, and I devised the show for them. It looks at a real-life story, that of Mrs. Yvonne Fletcher, who, and her socialisation. She was brought up on big bands and dance halls, and that was her fantasy life. She disappeared as often as she could into that world. She loved dancing, she loved that music. But the reality of her life was a much grimmer affair. A husband who drank and gambled and beat her, and she took the step of doing away with him. She did the same with a second husband who she later married, and again was ruining her perfect life. Essentially, the other interesting thing about it for me, this is a bit sordid, but it was an Australian first. A new form of rat poison had been marketed in about 1947-48 or so, and she was the first person in the world to ever administer this to husbands rather than rats. You know, a little tale. Chicago, I suppose, is in many ways prefigures a lot of my other work. I look at, in that play, the impact of large-scale political events on the individual, how you are affected by the world. Its storyline is that of a rather small or ordinary figure who attends a political convention, the 1968 Democratic Convention, when Mayor Daley and his Chicago, the National Guard and his police moved against a demonstration, largely inspired by the American countercultural movement. He gets swept up in those events. He can't handle it. He is constantly sort of invaded by those images, by what's happening out there in the street. This, in some ways, is akin, it's almost the same play, really, to Floating World. There's, in Floating World, what the main character takes, having once been a prisoner of war of the Japanese, takes a trip late in life to Japan, and again finds himself unable to handle stuff that he thought he'd repressed. It keeps coming back. The war and memories of the war keep coming back and start to threaten his sanity. He in fact ends up a mental wreck. It's that basic issue of how the public domain is constantly invading our private space. You can't keep it at bay. Finally, there's a cost to you as an individual that you pay for living in the kind of times you live in. Our century, I think, is one of massive social upheaval and traumas. 2 world wars are fairly obvious examples, but a history of war and revolution and social change that is visited on us all. I mean, even it is the century in which the motor car emerged, taking with it, you know, something in our own town like a huge number of people down the drain per year. That kind of thing, the mass incidence of trauma of one sort or another, I've always found a very fecund and interesting subject to investigate.
The position of Irene is interesting in there. I mean, there isn't a very strong development of the role of for the woman there. But if we can move on to plays a little later, for example, in plays like Top End that you've completed recently, which was written in 1988, I think. Right. Its stories, its characters, etc. There seems to me to be a development of, say, the figure of Norma is a sort of much more interesting and full and rounded picture of that kind of victim figure of the woman in the suburbs and... Well,
barely a victim. I mean, she's... what I got off on in Norma is you know, a right-wing figure that has a great life force in her. She's incredible. The great paradox there, I think, is that she's incredibly anti-socialist, anti-communist, whilst being, in essence, a great communard, a great community person. She's the right-wing heart and soul of Darwin. Her experiences immediately after Tracy, say, she was one of the people who held a ravaged town together. I quite admired her without for a minute thinking and I had to endorse her views. And in many ways that's the drama, where you can set up right versus left, old versus young, those kind of contentions I like. As for the portrayal of women, I guess we all, thanks to the impact of the feminist critique, are probably a bit better at, as male playwrights, at drawing women. I've always had the added impetus of being so close to a company, seeing women out of work unless you write work for them. And that has spurred me often down to creating portrayals of women.
The Top End itself, of course, has a wider framework than this. I mean, can you say something about why in 1988 you decided to write a play about the Timor crisis and the intervention in Timor and so on?
Yeah, sure. A real debt of honour, a bit of hidden history in a way. In the Second World War, there were Australians who were stranded on Timor as the Japanese overran that island and reached New Guinea. Some Australians had been left behind. They fought there for 18 months and were supported by the Timorese. These years later, the Timorese themselves are invaded yet again. What is Australia to do about it, about this debt of honour? And of course the answer was nothing, and a not very satisfactory answer from my point of view, and I for a long time you know, tried to sort out ways of getting that said.
There's a strong picture of Darwin. There's a picture of the trade union movement taking a much stronger line on the government on the issue. There's an affection for Darwin and a strong affection for the trade union movement. This hasn't yet been published. It's due to come out in Currency. So can you say a little bit about the characters that you selected, why you decided to write from the perspective of the wharf labourers and so on?
Sure. I wanted a fairly large canvas in a way. I drew on a spectrum of characters and their jobs. I wanted to look at Darwin. I travelled to Darwin to research the play. I was into recording in particular a week in 1975. The 7th or 8th of December is when the Indonesian invasion begins. A week later, on the 13th of December, is probably the most famous election in our time, the one that Fraser won after the Kerr-Whitlam dismissal. So by just taking a week, I sought really to write my 1975 play. It took until 1988 to bring it off. But again, I'm feeding on the social actuality.
You were involved in the production of the theatrical, musical production based, amazingly, on the most radical history of modern Australia, that by Manning Clark. It was called A History of Australia. What was your role in that, and what do you think of the fact that, you know, it had such a dreadful reception by the critics that it closed after...
Well, we got 7 weeks out of it.
7 weeks, and got most dreadful reviews. So can you talk a little bit about your involvement in that and about the text and its involvement?
I was there working as a script editor, as it were, for 2 writers who had the even harder task of breaking a 5-volume history down into something resembling 2 hours of theatre. So, as you can imagine, we all had that task of reducing it down to its essentials. Again, that was an attempt, I suppose, to put on stage that history, the history of our nation, 200 years in 2 hours. We chose Manning Clark. One of the writers working on the show is not just a gag writer for Max Gillies, nor a speechwriter for John Cain, but a historian, Don Watson. That was a 1988 project in a way, but it was an opportunity to talk about 200 years.
So it had a kind of bicentennial kind of...
Yeah, that was the marketing occasion. The artistic one, of course, was to yet again try and rehearse what we are, who we are, how we came about, and to do it in a form that would have a large popular appeal. We chose the musical, for instance, rather than the opera, for that reason. What do I think about how it fared? I'm never a musical of that sort has to run for quite a long time to recoup its costs. We didn't run for a long time, and we wiped out our capital base. I'm not very happy about that. It sucks, but in many ways the fault was there's no percentage blaming audience. I do think the critics had something of an instrumental role. They can kill you, and in this case they did.
Incidentally, people who have seen the show that I've spoken to, I wasn't either in Sydney or Melbourne at the time, but there was a very positive response to the show. Now, it's one of the many shows you've done that has a strong mixed media aspect to it. Jonah, again, recently, the use of the musical, popular theatre forms, disruption of naturalism. I mean, these have been features. How did you employ those specifically in this amazing task of doing, as you say, 5 volumes of history, 200 years, putting it on the stage in 2 hours? How do you see the theatre as an instrument to use to get that kind of effect? What did you specifically do?
Yeah, well, I mean, the song is like the poem, I guess, an amazing compression of feeling. A good folk song or popular song always manages, I think, to compress emotion and distill it and deliver it with great resonance. It's like it's the stone you drop in the pond, and the ripples are what the audience feels. It starts to resonate. So our trick there was to really try and get those key images, those key moments, and to get in song or dance quintessential or essential moments in history, which you can look at and read the rest of the story into. It's like I say, the trick of a good folk song, the trick of a good pop song.
It's jesting in that Brechtian sense. Specifically, you said you were influenced by him in that way, looking for the moment, that the social jest that encapsulates a resistance, a dialectic, or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, we chose most.
Can you think of one moment that did that in the show? Describe it for us.
I quite dug Ned Kelly's death. I thought we managed to a lot of the Ned Kelly stuff was quite interesting. I mean, Ned Kelly arrives at Glenrowan in an F.J. Holden as sort of a bodgy, so that you glimpse Kelly in the 1870s, in 1880, was a larrikin who found himself on the wrong side of the law. You can have a sort of modern correlative of that. You can understand the strata from which Kelly came and the perspectives that he had. He was an 1879 bodgy. He was an 1879 punk, if you like.
Not a silver bodgy, but...
Yeah, right. We were looking for those moments when the history could be understood by sometimes, modern correlatives, modern examples or whatever of it. We mixed our periods. And we time-travelled Manning Clark. He could, because he was a historian, go back to the past and live there. A modern man existing in a country called the past.
You've also worked a little in film and television. What's your feelings on that? I mean, as a medium, it's not known as being a particularly collaborative medium in that sense. It doesn't encourage an active response immediately from an audience, but can it be used? Can it be developed? Have you found it exciting? What's your reaction to it?
Yeah. One of the things that inclines me towards the theatre is that precisely what you're talking about in some ways, which is you can play it a lot looser. It is going to be different every night. Often just because the audience is different that night, often because the actors have been through the day and experienced what they've experienced, and inevitably that starts to seep into the work, maybe only in small ways, but it does. So that the theatre for me is a live medium in the truest sense. Film and television, you're live on the set, a bit like what we're doing here. We've got cameras out there watching us. This is an improvised interview. There ain't no script there. But there are limits of running time. Television and film are very, generally speaking, capital-intensive mediums, and people want to know what's happening with their money. They want to know whether or not the budget's going to blow out. These kind of nuts and bolts considerations apply to the theatre in a way. They apply even more significantly to big-buck mediums like making a feature film or making a television series. On a series, you've got a huge number, an army of people wandering around, working, who have to know what's required and when. You have to timetable and schedule labour to the nth. So consequently, it's not a very relaxed form of creativity. Nevertheless, even just doing it for a camera, a performer has to be and deliver a live performance. So even there, something of that liveness creeps in. You are capturing performance when you're using a camera. And you will then use another machine, like a little black box or a movie projector, to reproduce it by mechanical means. But what you've captured is, in essence, live performance. So I don't distinguish in some ways between the mediums, and work from one to the other quite easily, because there is at the core that relationship between you as a writer and actors who are doing the show. Be it
Does
a
the size
TV show.
of the TV audience attract you? The fact that you can speak to a large number of people? And to a very diverse, I suppose, range of kinds of people too. I mean, across the economic barriers of theatre, after all, is mainstream theatre at least, is a fairly expensive activity these days.
Sure. Again, this is one of the things that I like about the theatre, and it's a difference between it and TV and film. The biggest audience you get in terms of television, whilst in aggregate through the society often numbers millions. I mean, they who watch Neighbours regularly is a substantial proportion of the population. But how do they view it? They view it often solo, themselves alone watching a little box. At most, they've probably got the rest of the family there. Occasionally, and we see this in third world countries, you have maybe 30 people gathered around a TV set. You see that at pubs, perhaps. There is something of an audience. But even the smallest of theatres, La Mama, has a real audience. You can have a mass that are seeing the same thing with each other, in each other's presence. And that's what I love about the theatre, that you can create a sense of the community that audience constitutes at this moment in time while it's happening. And you have there what I really believe is a mass effect. They can affect each other. I laugh, I trigger a laugh in you and you and you and you and you, or we all boo, or we all hiss, or we experience it very differently, so that you begin to sense, hey, so-and-so likes this show, but I know I don't. And you become aware of social differences and class differences and things of that sort. But the creation of an audience in the theatre is probably one of its finest achievements, one of the most interesting dimensions in which it operates. In film and television, you've got shadows on a screen, and people are looking at that, and they're often looking at it. Cinema audiences can have a large are in a mass, and they can affect each other and enjoy, and we all laugh at Woody Allen together and so on and so forth. And going to the flicks is a social occasion in ways that going to the theatre is. But we as an audience for film and television can't affect the performers. We can't by how we are feeling, we can't transmit, hey, we're loving this, mate, or the reverse, you know, what is this? So it's the ability of an audience to affect you that attracts me. I find that a bit of a drug, working live to a live audience.
You mentioned the word community. I mean, now can I lead you into the fact that if you look through the body of work you've produced over the last 20 years, I must say the thing is that it is one of the most substantial bodies of work done in Australia. Very little of it, unfortunately, is available in a published form, and so in a sense that has led to a lower profile for your work than otherwise it might have got. Now, a lot of that has been the result of your working in community theatre groups, in ensemble groups where the pieces may have been, in the literary sense, the textual sense, ephemeral, but to have been very important pieces of theatre, interventions in various ways in the theatrical contribution to the social debate that's gone on and the community debate in Australia. Can you say something about how you see community theatre work in relation to mainstream and ensemble work in relation to scripted work, and give some examples of why you've chosen to go this route with particular texts and plays?
Yeah, there's a few things there, isn't there? A lot of this work has been commissioned. A lot of it is a small company, say a theatre and education team here or a small community theatre group there, asks for a piece to be written. It commissions it. I look at who's working for that company. I often hang out with that company, get some sense of what these actors are capable of doing. There is no point writing a commissioned work that doesn't satisfy a brief of that sort. There is no point writing a hugely male text for a company that is largely made up of actresses and so on and so forth. So you tailor the work to who's available and what they can do. I always like to find out if how many people can sing, how many people can use a musical instrument, how many people have specific physical skills, like can they do acrobatics? Could they, are they aerial artists? Do they have any circus skills? I'm very interested in how those skills can then be brought into the show I write, in mobilising.
Can you give an example of that, of a
and
show
exploiting those things? Sure. Kelly Dance is perhaps a good one. Here are a number of, and this was a piece that I wrote finally for just people in their last year at a drama course. A number of them already worked and earned a bit of cash as a bush band. And a number of them were very interested in the Australian folk tradition. And could, at the drop of a hat, you know, sing Moreton Bay or all that old stuff. And so that was a pre-existing set of skills. It predated the script. Now, it was put to me that maybe this could become the stuff on which a production could be based. The other input there was the director, Jules Hollidge, and the designer, or someone who had input on the design side. We didn't have much of a budget, so it's wrong to say it was a design show. Had just seen a large Bushwhackers concert in Adelaide at Centennial Hall, which is like the showgrounds in Adelaide. And here were 1,000 Australians dancing things like Strip the Willow and Ned Kelly's Farewell to Glenrowan and various 19th century social dance forms, bush dancing. And it then struck us too that Australia is littered with flat-floored halls. Every town throughout the country has a hall. It's used, everyone knows about it. They've either gone there for a school function, the football dinner dance, the night the town won the premiership. All those things have occurred there. So it's a space that's foreign to none of them. They're quite happy in it. Here was a chance to actually build the audience attending a dance into a show. Now, the characteristic of lots of that music is that it does have lost, the key to which has often been lost, but it does have a narrative base. A thing like stripping the willow is in fact an old image that is drawn from doing just that. Peeling the bark off off willow was essentially a physical image that could be danced. A number of these dances are rooted in rural festivals, bringing in the hay, those kind of activities. So already the audience is acting in a way. A number of these dances operate in a circle. Now, we did smart things like the Kelly gang, Ned Kelly and co, are on the run. They are being pursued by the Fuzz, by the police. Okay, let's have the Kellys in the dance along with the audience, and they're proceeding in a circle. Cops are there chasing them. So that a thing like the chase, the hunt for the Kellys, is conducted inside the form of a social dance. That one was virtually just the Pride of Erin, but a progressive one. So that now in progressive dancing, I don't know how well whether you dance or not. Oh, look at those shoes. You pass on. You dance a certain amount of time with one partner and then move on to the next. So the Kellys were moving on and dancing with audience members, and they would be saying things like, "Don't put us into the cops," or whatever. So that you would be drawing the audience into the action. There is another form of the dance that we used there, which was a dance that the bushwhackers made fairly popular, which is called the drongo. Now, essentially, it's a form of musical chairs where one person is left without a partner. And it's quite arbitrary. The music stops and you grab people. Now, the arbitrary nature of that happening to you, we hope to compare with the arbitrary nature in which Kelly supporters and people in the northeast of Victoria during the era of the Kelly outbreak were picked on by the coppers. Very arbitrary arrests were made. People were often detained for months on end in an absolutely, by chance, sheer chance. So that experience for the audience of being the last one left out, we hope to inject, get them to, by experiencing they could understand what had occurred historically.
So you're using
in
existing forms, in effect, to tailor that to the message rather than sort of forcing some.
Now, and it's not just talking, it's getting the audience to experience with their own bodies what physically occurred.
You've done some work recently with the Melbourne Workers' Theatre. Can we say something briefly about that?
Sure. I've twice now in my life been associated with companies that sought to take shows into workplaces, into factory canteens where we would work during lunch hours, and often working just on factory floors. Whilst workers stopped, we gather an audience from the workers. We do this with the consent both of management and the unions, obviously. It's often very hard to get past the factory gate. But the idea is to build a circuit, to take art into places of that sort. Often this work currently is being done under a scheme called the Art and Working Life Program. Now, essentially, this makes a lot of it is in fact a piece of social policy designed to bring equity and social justice in the distribution of artistic goods and services to Australia. It's the case that a lot of the state's money is poured into art centres and theatres that by and large play to a narrow section of our society. A scheme of this sort seeks to redress that by delivering art, in this case theatre, to people where they work.
What's your role in this been? Have you been working as a writer, stroke dramaturg, director? I mean, do you produce
both those things? Yeah, I'm finally doing a script with Melbourne Workers Theatre, but hitherto I've worked as a dramaturg, which is sort of script editing, working closely with a writer, often a young writer who's perhaps learning his or her craft.
This is putting very much on the line what you said from the beginning of your career, that you see yourself as a theatre worker, not a writer. I mean, many writers who have achieved, I mean, what you've done in terms, would not be prepared to do those kinds of roles, but I mean, you are still doing this. But you're also writing at the moment, and this is what I find interesting, there's a re-emergence, there's the re-blossoming of John Romeril in the mainstream theatre. I mean, Top End, which I regard, I read the script of last night, and I think it's superb. I fortunately wasn't produced in Perth.
Right.
And also of Lost Weekend. So there's a double progress going on here, an involvement as a theatre worker and at the same time the emergence of you in mainstream theatre. Can you say something about these two processes? I mean, is this an example of your untidiness again? Or?
I would have to say yes, but also...
creative untidiness, I might add.
Yeah, we're talking to, the forces of economic necessity. Often you just, go where the work is. I don't run a theatre company. I do not have a band of actors who I work with all the time in a full-time way. So I do, and I also have ideas for shows that I know will just take scripted form. They won't be written for anyone in particular. I will then try and sell them to companies that may or may not be interested. Just freelance work, as opposed to commission work, or as opposed to working with a particular company or a particular set of actors in mind. Both Top End and Lost Weekend were the result of getting... I was given a $20,000, I regarded as long service leave. But it meant I could step aside and bring up to speed certain things that I'd had kicking around, or ideas that I'd been slowly working on for some years, but bring them online, as it were. I could actually sit down without having to earn for the next year or so, and crank out shows that I'd been worrying at for some time. And those
Top End, particularly about the Timorese situation. You did that in '88.
Yes.
Now, Black Cargo is the one with the Melbourne Workers Theatre. In Top End, there's quite a lot about the involvement of the Australian trade union movement in various periods of history, with the Sukarno period in Indonesia, and then the blacking of cargo designed to go to the Indonesian people at the time when they were invading East Timor. Is there a connection between those two shows?
There isn't.
There isn't. Just the title.
Yeah. Black Cargo is in fact a short story by John Morrison, who's an old, he's 86 now and not in the best of health. In fact, he's got very bad RSI and has had for a long time, so his output has been rather cruelly limited by that. But John was one of the realists, a sort of worker writer who hung out with the Overland group, with people like Alan Marshall and Judah Watton. And he wrote Black Cargo, which is like, I find a very dramatic short story, and that's why I started to rip it off, as it were. It's 4 days in the life of a union official as a dispute escalates around him. And already you've got in that a sort of time scheme. The show starts with the beginning of the dispute, ends as it reaches a certain point, as it's solved at a certain level. So you're looking at a drama of consciousness, essentially, how this guy is going to win. How he is going to have his way, get his position endorsed by the membership. It so happens that he's a seaman and he has to get on side the Waterside Workers Union. At the time, the Seamen's Union, as it still is a very left-oriented union. At the time, the Waterside Workers had a right-wing leadership and by and large a fairly right-wing membership. So winning their support, you had already a battle of left and right. going on there. I guess what drew me to it, or why do it now, is that unionism is facing very changed times. A problem of dwindling membership and on the one hand, as many of the old unions sort of contract down, waterside workers being a particularly obvious example, whereas in 1950 you've got 100,000 people working the wharves. By 1990 there is 10, and they're going for 5. So those things are occurring, but the battle between pragmatism and principle is what I was particularly looking at, and I think that's kind of a nerve ending at the moment.
Sure is, I think.
Yeah.
Well, you're mentioning time schemes. I think we're kind of coming to the end of our built-in time scheme, but I wonder if I can just ask you to finish, what do you think is the future for progressive performance arts in Australia, and where the route ahead lies?
Yeah. Well, I've always had a very optimistic outlook on these things. I think there is something in this culture that does know it is a new world society. We have always had little and put little store in or stock in tradition. We face, I think, an enormous sort of change socially and economically as the economic picture changes, as the East becomes the engine of the global economy, as not just the Japanese economy, which is already a preeminent economy, but as the Chinese economy, the Indian economy, and a country so close like Indonesia is just a massive market, a massive productive force. It will change the name of the game in Australia in a most marked way. So anyone who's even got half a brain realises that change is on the agenda in a big way. And consequently, I think people are predisposed to hearing new messages or messages about how we ought to at least consider change, or we have to be flexible, we have to adapt. These are kind of key words and key forms of cultural behaviour. We have to be tolerant, we have to become not monolingual, we have to become bilingual or multilingual. We are already a multicultural kind of society. These things percolate through the culture, and art is being born that follows that drift. I think life leads, art follows. I've never considered myself to be particularly in advance of my times. I'm perhaps attuned to the drift and able perhaps to articulate it, but it's not the case that I'm saying anything that isn't happening. I'm simply saying what is happening in as fresh and as immediate and as dramatically compelling a way as I can manage.
John Romeril, I think you not only are doing that, but have done that successfully over the last 20 years that you've worked in theatre. Just like to thank you very much, and it's been tremendously illuminating to hear you talk about your own work. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Gareth.